Hi everyone. It's time for part 2 of this particular presentation as to why to do workflow and how to do workflow, actually best strategies and practices. Now, most of you in fact have been here in the previous session, but just in case there is a newcomer or two, and for those of you tuning in afterwards to look at the recording of this, about me, I am the original SharePoint evangelist. I was, in fact, someone had to go first. I worked at Microsoft for 11 years, was one of the people that helped launch SharePoint, and what can I say? It used to be my job to knock on doors begging technical professionals to care about this SharePoint thingy. If you were a developer, back in those days, you used to pat us on the head and say, "Oh, SharePoint, isn't that cute?" And if you were in IT, it was your job to say, "SharePoint, no, you can't have custom web parts. You might destabilize my servers." By the way, it's a problem the app model solves. But this is not the track for that. Just to suffice to say, I've been at SharePoint a long, long, long time. I've spent the last 7 years at a company called Nintex. We are in the workflow business, but I have actually been doing workflow work for 25 years. I know something about the subject, and I'm sharing that expertise with you in this 2-part series. This is focused on approaches to take to doing workflow, not so much which tools you should use or which specific design techniques are effective. Those are better done in the information worker or developer tracks. I usually talk in those tracks. This particular year, we're talking about why to do workflow and how to go about it and what kind of decisions you should be making for your organizations. I have had past lives in development, in IT, in research and development, and I've been a power user on more than one occasion. And now, this is the theme for part 2 of all of this. We talked about lots of different reasons for doing workflow last hour, but I'm actually going to bring this one up. This actually is the most important thing. The number one reason to do workflow is to reuse thought. If every problem is an original problem, we'll never be able to automate it. But if someone comes up with a really good idea or a good practice or a way to prevent something bad from happening, so we don't have to make those same decisions every single time, that's a good thing. The purpose of workflow is to reuse thought. And when we ended last time, we were talking about the notion of the citizen developer and how citizen developers usually use low-code or no-code tools to build processes for their fellow users in their individual business units or departments or divisions or what have you. And the best thing for IT to do is not to fight that, but lead it by providing centers of excellence, by providing examples, by providing guidance, by providing tools and resources and so on. And one of the things they can do is to help facilitate the reuse of thought. So to build on that, let's say you have a developer in developer land doing developer-y things, or even using low-code, no-code tools. Real developers use low-code, no-code tools all the time. If they're good tools, they get used because you can get more done in less time, even though you have coding skills. But let's say you do some work. It's an awfully good idea to put that stuff off to the side and build up a whole library of things so that that can be used by citizen developers out in the trenches. Essentially, reusing best practices is a big deal, and only IT can really do that well. Why do workflow? To reuse thought, not replace thought. We don't want to replace thought, meaning if a situation requires original thought, that is not a good candidate for automation, which is why a lot of processes that are often thought of as mission critical or high profile or centralized or so on aren't good candidates for automation, because the conditions either change far too frequently or far too many people are involved for which consensus cannot be achieved, or it's a situation that you're actively curating. It has your full attention. You will be making judgments on the fly. And therefore, it's not something that you make some decisions on and then save it and reuse it over and over again. Reuse thought, don't replace it. Oh, the other thing about this is, you shouldn't be a slave to a process. Processes should help. Processes, and this is guidance you need to give citizen developers. You don't want employees to find processes annoying. They're supposed to help. They're supposed to cut down on time. They're supposed to cut down on annoyances. If processes actually require that more work be done, you've done something wrong. IT should be really good at harvesting things, finding best practices out in the trenches, perhaps refining them or improving them a little bit, and then making them available to everyone else. This was the final thing I wanted to say before I jumped into part 2 of all of this, which is the wonderful world of integration. And in fact, to a large number of people out there, workflow is integration. That's how they view the whole world. To some people, workflow is all about approvals. To others, it's all about doing integration. In fact, has anyone ever heard of a product called If This Then That, or Zapier? Yeah, those are very, very simple workflow tools focused on integrating one product with another product. The process is brain dead simple. It's wait for that to happen, then do this, and stop. But it's entirely focused on integration, even though it may fulfill some things that don't feel like integration. Integration is really, it's the watchword now. I'll tell you what, it's a reality. You really need to think about it, because I know you look like the same crowd as last hour. Might be a few new people, but and thank you, but and one or two, yeah, it's almost the same group. And when I asked you last time, only a few of you are using Office 365, maybe 10%. That's all right, sounds about right. Here's the thing. There was a time when we in SharePoint thought that you should put everything in SharePoint, and it was our job to find more and more ways to make SharePoint a good place to put your stuff so that you could share anything using SharePoint. Well, and just because we moved it up to the cloud, we as the community, for some use cases and workloads, this is still a SharePoint-centric view of the universe, except it's not very accurate. There are people out there using OneDrive, and I do not mean OneDrive for business, I mean regular old OneDrive. You get that for free. Don't tell me people aren't using it and putting business assets in it. In fact, realistically, come on, let's not kid ourselves, people are using Dropbox. And it's okay to say this, Microsoft is very good friends with Dropbox these days. You can use Office Online tools inside of Dropbox. Dropbox fully accessible on all of Microsoft's most recent versions of their apps and so on. This is not a controversy. Yeah, you've got corporate assets sitting off in Dropboxes. Heck, let's not kid ourselves. You've got some organizations that are also keeping some things in Box or Google Drive, and even if you don't, you work with other organizations that do. And you can't stop working with them just because they store their documents in the wrong facility. This is the norm today. This isn't weird, this is completely standard. In fact, it's not limited to content stores. How about email as a service? Yes, this is Exchange. It's living inside of Office 365, or it could be from an independent hoster. These are the icons for Salesforce.com or Microsoft's Dynamics CRM, respectively. MailChimp is a small-scale email marketing facility. Marketo is a much bigger, more ambitious thing. Over there, that's Rackspace and Azure, and Amazon. Infrastructure as a service, provisioning virtual machines on demand. How about utility services? How about for translation or currency conversions and such, or URL shortening. Or social media. There are opportunities for doing social media in business processes. There's the opportunity to access data and traditional applications that might be available on premises, might be available in the cloud. I don't really care where the stuff lives. It's just that the cloud became this sort of giant internet service bus that made everything available simultaneously, which is why most of these things are cloudy. And I mean that in a good way, not a bad way, but they don't have to be in the cloud. They could be on premises as well. What I would suggest and what I would put to you is that the right way to think about doing a lot of workflow projects or business process automation projects is to think in this term defined by Forrester Research. Process mashups. You've heard of mashups. It was all the rage a couple of years ago, and the idea was pull multiple things together on one page, link them together, like link a map with weather data, or link a map with sales data, or link a map. There's a repeatable pattern here. People usually thought to link a map with something, and that's why if you only have one idea, a paradigm tends to die. It's like up until the most recent batch of smartwatches, most smartwatch projects for the past 20 years where you can get stock quotes on your wrist. Okay, that's slightly useful for a handful of people, but if that's the only use case you can think of, you failed. So mashups are a big deal, but process mashups are, I've got this thing and that thing and I want to put them together to get something done. Let me give you a couple of examples. Here's a great process mashup. You have a press release. You have a marketing department or public relations department, and you have a press release that you will want to release in 1 week's time. You're getting ready for it, and you need to run this through the review process, and it's going to need to get examined by a professional editor, a wordsmith. It's going to need to be reviewed by management to make sure it's saying the right thing and it achieves the right goals. It's going to need to go through a lawyer in order to or an attorney, a barrister, no, solicitor would be the correct term here, but the point is someone who inspects it and makes certain that we aren't saying anything that will get us in trouble. Again, where I live, you get sued left and right, so this is a bigger deal, but still a non-trivial thing anywhere on the planet. Make sure legal takes a peek at it. And then if all that works, give it to a publisher. Now, that sounds like not a bad idea for a business process, right? It's not a bad idea at all, but it's incomplete. It leaves too much on the table because if we have the tools at hand to automate the review process, why stop there? Let's automate the publishing process. Sitecore might be the platform we use for our public-facing website, or maybe we're still using Office 365, or maybe we're using something based on WordPress. I don't really care. Let's take that content that we've moved about in a review process and inject that into our publishing platform. The APIs are there. Why don't we have the workflow process take care of that for us? Why don't we, otherwise we're just blindly asking a publisher, yo, publish this. And we can do that, but why stop? In fact, why stop at that? When you publish something, you're probably going to find out what the URL is of the newly published content. Why not tweet about it immediately? Why not post a notice about it on your Facebook wall? Why not alert all of your employees using Yammer or Chatter or Slack or whatever the heck it is you guys use in order to let them know that, hey, this could even be an email blast. This big thing we've all been working on for months, the press release just went out. This is our official tweet about it. If you're inclined to do so, please retweet. Automate the promotion process. In fact, let's kick it up a notch. Typically, if we're working on the press release this week and it's going to be released next week, I'm going to give it to my PR agency this week, an external service, because there are people that specialize in placing articles in different publications. They'll put it on newswires, basically information feeds that journalists take a look at, but they'll also contact specific journalists they know care about this topic and alert them to it. So I want them to have it in advance. So my process will actually be, go ahead and do the touchy-feely review bit. And then when it comes out of that and everyone's approved it, immediately give this to my PR agency with an embargo date on it. And my PR agency, I don't hire these people because of the content management system they use. I hire them because they're good at what they do. They use Dropbox. That's fine. They've shared a folder with me, so I'm just going to drop it in our shared Dropbox folder. They've got it. And there's an embargo date on it. They'll work on it. And then I'm just going to have the workflow wait until the publish date, pound that into our public-facing website, do the tweeting, do the Facebook wall posts, alert everybody to retweet, and Bob's your uncle. Not a bad way to go. That's a process mashup. And don't tell me it's unrealistic. It's actually incredibly useful. I'll give you another one, employee onboarding. I already talked about this in the previous hour, but let's kick it up a notch. Yes, you come on board our organization. If HR tells me that you're coming on board, and they give me enough notice, and that notice could be a day for all I care because I've got this automated. I've done my homework. We receive a request. If it's properly formatted, we will automatically provision your Active Directory account. In fact, we'll calculate a unique username for you based on your name. And if it happens to match someone else, we'll throw a little rider on the end of it or some number of something. Sorry, or we'll try a different combination and move the words around or letters around a little bit. We'll resolve a unique username for you. We'll provision an account. Then we'll create a mailbox. Then we'll create link privileges. In fact, if we're using link for telephony, we'll generate a telephone number for you. Then we'll provision a SharePoint user profile for you. Right now, we will not wait for synchronization to take place because I immediately want to add some values in there that aren't maintained somewhere else. Then I'm going to wait until your start date. Because if he's your manager, let me ask you this. Would you rather receive an email with his logon details the day he shows up for work or possibly several weeks beforehand? You look like a very conscientious man. In fact, I know you, but you're a good guy. You'll put it in a folder or so on, but let's face it, you don't really want to do that. You'd rather have the information right when you need it. Processes, workflows, why don't we let them do the waiting? So we'll set up everything for you and tell him right when he needs it, right when you come to work on your first day. But let's say this is a sales department. I need to provision a Salesforce.com account for you as well. In fact, I might want to, if we're not using Yammer Enterprise, I might want to provision a Yammer account for you as well, and I need to do that manually. Or perhaps you're a developer, in which case I might want to set up your dev and test environment, but we're using virtual machines that are maintained in Azure or in Amazon EC2 or something along those lines. And so I'll go ahead and provision those so that they're ready for you. In fact, I'll do two, one for dev, one for test. That's not really a worry, but I will provision everything you need to do your job so that it's ready on day one. By the way, this is both efficient and a new business opportunity, because who has ever shown up for work and discovered that it would be a few hours or days or maybe even weeks before you could really do your job? Yes, don't worry, I will not incriminate anyone. It's happened to me multiple times. It's a joy when you show up and everything just works. In fact, you tell your friends. In fact, that companies' reputations get a little bit better under those circumstances. Routing leads. Anyone ever gone through a merger or an acquisition? Yeah, I don't need hands. Some of you have, some of you haven't, but you know what I'm talking about. Well, some organizations might be using Salesforce.com and others might be using CRM, and if they've merged or one acquired the other, they're not going to throw away all the old software right away. That's highly disruptive and inefficient and possibly dangerous. But if they're now one company and based on geographies or based on divisions, they use different applications, especially if you're allowing lines of business to make some of their own decisions with your guidance. This could happen even in the absence of a merger or acquisition. But you have lead capturing that might happen on an exhibit hall floor or something to that effect. Well, in that kind of circumstance, it's a really good idea to let the workflow do the routing of the lead and put it in CRM if it makes sense, or put it in Salesforce.com if it makes sense. But don't make the person on the floor decide, oh, which app should I fire up in order to input my lead? Let's have a form, let's have a process that takes care of that for you. Another process mashup. Why bother with SharePoint? I make sure I have at least one slide on this topic in each hour. This is important because, yes, workflow is a topic worthy of itself, but I am talking about this as a SharePoint conference. As it turns out, SharePoint is an excellent workflow platform. It has a workflow engine. In fact, it has two. It has a place to put content. It's hard to do a workflow effort without persisting some data someplace. That could be documents, that could be metadata, that could be identities, that could be a lot of things. But SharePoint gives that to you. It has a surface for composing aggregate applications, web parts and such. You can pull together things on one page. In fact, if you combine workflow with business intelligence, you can gather insight and then take action on it. SharePoint is a very, very, very good place to do workflow. And there is plenty of tool support from Microsoft itself and from many, many third parties. Now, I care about integration. I care about process mashups, and I care about more formal efforts too. But what I care about especially is making sure you rethink the problem. Because a lot of you will think, does anyone use SAP? I'm going to use SAP as a convenient animal here, because it's particularly daunting for most people. So what I see people asking for when they ask for SAP integration is that the idea is you've got the world of SharePoint, which is friendly and office-centric and human-friendly and so on, and you have SAP, which is harsh and dark and transaction-oriented, and you know, it's a dark tower, but it must be appeased. And what we'd like to have is people not have to go near that dark tower. So the integration effort that people have in mind is build a process out here in SharePoint land and have it keep SAP at arm's length, pulling information from there behind the scenes when necessary and pushing instructions to it when necessary, but not letting the user or even SAP know what's going on. You're treating it like a puppet master or poking it with a stick or something like that. That's the approach a lot of people have. This is not always the wrong approach. In fact, depending on the app, it's absolutely the right approach. But the more interesting or complex the app, integrating with the data is not the right approach to take. Many other times, you're not going to just, well, how about this? You don't just have software. You have people. You have people that maintain that software, people that design solutions based on those platforms and so on. Those people have their own processes. And what you might find yourself doing is integrating process to process rather than process to resource. Distributed processes. It's okay. In fact, just as long as you're aware of it, it's perfectly okay, for example, for an invoice to come into SAP and SAP's people realizing full well that other than a couple of people that live in SAP all the time, like our accounting friend, who I found out is not an actual accountant, but we're going to pretend you are for the remainder of this session. All right, thanks. I do appreciate that. So anyway, in comes an invoice. Now, for people that live in SAP, navigating down through 9 screens in order to get to the invoice item, and then writing down the number of the document that contains the image of that, and then navigating out and then back into the image to take a peek at it, and then navigating out and going back to the record to approve it, is not a daunting thing. But for the rest of us, that kind of sucks. So instead, how about if we have the people in SAP recognize that when they receive this invoice, it's not a bad idea, in fact, it's not a crime at all, to throw it over the wall into SharePoint land, drop it into a document library, set some properties on it that describe the image, and let a SharePoint-centric workflow take over and hand you a notice saying, yo, approve this or reject it and tell me which cost center it belongs to. And we do that in a nice, friendly, SharePoint-y, Office-y way, and you approve that on whatever way you want, and then your decision gets brought back to SAP, which picks it up and continues to run with it and deals with all the accounts payable details and all that kind of stuff. Everybody wins, and nobody loses control over their processes. And you should be ready to think this way too. And by the way, citizen developers will be clueless to do this by themselves without the help of IT. This is a perfect example of IT acting as supreme facilitator, coach, cheerleader, and coordinator of a lot of efforts. Because citizen developers might build this part over there on the left, but I guarantee you IT is doing the stuff on the right. And a cooperative thinking IT department can make everyone happier this way, especially because the way it gets approved might vary from line of business to line of business. Integrate processes and people. Now, who's going to do the integration? As it turns out, much like processes and much like workflow, everyone's doing it. Integration turns out to be a big, fat, hairy deal. I'll give you an example. Let's take someone, we'll call him John. John is an enterprise service bus guy. Magical piece of software to which you plug in every corporate asset you possibly can. You send a magic request into the bus, it goes to wherever it's supposed to go, does whatever it does, brings you back a result. In fact, a lot of you think the solution to integration is to build this magic bus. And it used to be. But the world's changing too rapidly and APIs are shifting and the types of uses for those different systems that you might have plugged into a bus in the past might not be true anymore. But some stable apps, yeah, better to reach them using a bus than talk to them directly, SAP being a wonderful example of that. But here's another example. John's in IT, by the way. Susan, she runs the sales division. And what she's decided to do is buy Salesforce, or actually subscribe to Salesforce. And she's got somebody in her division who's going to do a little bit of work in collaboration with someone in IT who knows the APIs to build something that takes orders that are placed into Salesforce and push them into the ERP system, so they can get handled by accounts receivable and manufacturing floor fulfillment and all that kind of stuff. But she doesn't want to touch SAP, it's not responsive, it doesn't help facilitate sales, but obviously part of the process does involve doing a mashup with SAP. Give you another example, still in sales, Chris. Chris is our top performing salesperson. Chris has decided that she doesn't really want to use Salesforce 100% of the time because she lives off of her phone. She lives out of Outlook. She's constantly doing that. And she's decided that she'll use if this, then that, or Zapier to take all of her contact entries in Salesforce and push them into her personal address book, so that she always has them handy so that if someone calls her, there's automatic recognition as to who's whom, using caller ID and such. You don't get that if you leave all your contacts in Salesforce. So she has a better experience if she's got the tools in, if the data comes to her instead of making her go to the app. That's another form of integration, even though it was just, if I get a new contact in Salesforce, then push it into my personal address book, maintained in Google Contacts or something like that. All of that's fine. Everyone's doing integration. And this is important. Is it all about the bus? And if you're thinking about that song, I'm sorry. I didn't really mean to make that be a pun, but or a bad reference. But it's not all about the bus, and I'm going to prove to you why. Here's a workflow. And that workflow at a certain point is going to want to talk to something that lives somewhere else. Let's say this is a workflow for capturing leads. And it's happening in a friendly app that we've built that might work on a mobile device or might work inside of Outlook or might work in whatever it is. It's a workflow process that doesn't begin in our customer relationship management system. It begins somewhere closer to the users. But I need to get this into Salesforce.com. And what you might be thinking of is, I've got this enterprise service bus or this object layer of some sort, and its job is to abstract away what's going on up here and just present me with something that we're going to call a lead, which belongs to a collection of things called leads. And I will somewhere in the back end connect this up to Salesforce, but you don't need to know about that. You just talk to a lead. You're building your app or whatnot, you talk to the lead object or the lead endpoint. Here's the thing. You might want the option to decide at some point that I don't want to use Salesforce.com. I get a better deal from Microsoft Dynamics CRM, or they have a feature that I want that Salesforce doesn't offer, so I want to switch it. And the promise of an enterprise service bus or an abstract object layer or something like that is that you can make this connection without having to change the workflow process or even letting the user know, because all I'm doing is remapping the object to a different source. That's nice, but it's not realistic. Certainly not today, and here's why. It forgets something that's really, really important. Salesforce.com is not the same thing as Microsoft Dynamics CRM. They are different products. There's an overlap. They're both used for many of the same use cases, but they are different. And my guess is that if you decide, I don't want to use Salesforce anymore, I want to use Dynamics CRM, it's probably for a reason. You probably want to take advantage of whatever it is that CRM does that's different and special and unique, et cetera, which means I don't want to talk to a generic lead object. In fact, here's the deal. If you drop CRM and replace it with Salesforce, you're probably going to need to rebuild your abstract object too in order to be aware of the new features in the new platform. And if I have to not only change the source, but the mapping layer, the abstraction, the bus endpoint, I've doubled my work. Why? It's not saving you any time. In fact, here's the other part that's difficult. Remember, this solution is not being built by someone else in IT who knows all about the bus. This is being built by somebody who is very special in sales. He's the citizen developer in the sales division, or one of them, which means he doesn't care necessarily about all the other objects in the bus. In fact, you show him all of this stuff, he'll freak out. What's more, if you need to change these when they get remapped to a different content source because we find it to be superior, this is a maintenance nightmare. In fact, it's a documentation nightmare because we have to teach those citizen developers about all of these things. And here's the other thing. We actually need to teach the citizen developers a whole new language of our own, because buses and object layers are built, not bought. Well, you might start with some foundational stuff, but you'll be building a lot of it yourself, which means you have to document it. Whereas, if I'm in sales, I know what Salesforce.com looks like. I know what Microsoft CRM looks like. If I'm in marketing, I know what Marketo looks like. In fact, I will talk in Marketo terminology about things. And I don't want you to teach me an entire new language that's deliberately generic. In fact, if I decide we're not going to use MailChimp anymore, we're trading up to Marketo, I'm going to talk in Marketo speak because I've been talking with my Marketo sales rep in technical contact. It's not about the bus. It's about the API. Realistically speaking, maintain, catalog, explain, and help people with APIs. You'll have an easier time of things. In other words, if you want to talk to Salesforce, create some reusable components that are direct connections to Salesforce. The UI for configuring those components uses Salesforce terminology. They talk directly to Salesforce's API. You build that, they'll use it. And they won't be confused or frightened by it. You want to switch to CRM? Give them a component that talks directly to CRM and speaks CRM. It's about the APIs. In fact, APIs are getting easier and easier. They used to look a whole lot like crazy function calls. Now an API is basically, people call them endpoints. It's a URL, like a web page. And you can either get something from it or put something in it or something like that. But instead of a page, it's actually a real thing. That's how RESTful web services work. It's actually quite nice. So basically, the world's coming to you with better and better APIs. You don't need to abstract them. In fact, it gets in the way. It's about the APIs. In fact, it's not just about citizen development, it's about citizen integration. Citizen integrators, it's a real thing. IT can lead citizen integration. One, catalog and document those APIs. Turns out that if everyone is used to REST, again, it's just a question of knowing what the verbs are and what the URLs are, and you can get to whatever you need. You can watch out for scalability problems, because here is the thing. Although most, the 80-20 rule applies, you can get 80% of the work done with 20% of the effort or something to that effect. The 80-20 rule is an overloaded concept. But the point is, at a certain point, letting everyone just call APIs will stop scaling, and you need to start thinking of a more efficient way to get more done. In fact, almost every citizen integration effort has the potential to cross the chasm from something in citizen developer land, from one mode of IT into the other mode of IT, which is operational and stable and highly scalable and highly repeatable. You need to watch for those opportunities, because someday you might provide the API in question because your way of talking to some back-end system is far more scalable. Watch for it. Watch for overspending. Because if it turns out that several different departments are all doing individual subscriptions for Marketo, maybe you want to pool resources. That's just an economic thing. There's no crazy technological stuff involved there. Watch for endpoint creep. Too many APIs that are redundant, that starts to get crazy. You might want to suggest that rather than reinvent the wheel, someone else already solved that problem, facilitate reuse. You're the only ones that will notice it. Watch for compliance problems, because if you're storing credentials inside of workflows and someone changes the password, your workflow is going to break, and you won't notice it until something bad happens. And then everybody will flail about trying to fix it. So there are certain best practices that you can advocate. Monitor the lines of business, because sometimes they come up with really, really good ideas everyone else should use. And sometimes you know things that they don't. Help them. Finally, last two things, procure and manage self-service tools. Select good low-code, no-code tools that citizens can use in order to create things for themselves. And then finally, build that repository of integration assets. And again, that may be nothing more than a catalog of APIs, but it may be streams, that may be templates, that may be cloud services, that could be a lot of different things. Last thing, or near the last thing, I want to take a moment and talk about mobility because it comes up a lot. There are people that talk about mobile all the time. And this is more of a warning. Because when we talk about mobility, we typically think, okay, people are using those things less and less, these things more and more. People are using tablets all the time. In fact, let's see, that's a tablet, that's a tablet. Yeah, that's a tablet. I'm not seeing people with laptops out at the moment. I'm seeing people with tablets out. Now, that's fine. That's good. I love mobility. The thing is, Mobility is not about creating a magic app. Processes are processes are processes. In fact, here's the best advice I could take on it. From Satya Nadella, mobility isn't about my device, it's about me. It's about being where the user is, wherever that happens to be. So if you're going to create solutions and you want them to be used, you should be thinking adaptively. And this is more of a user interface or user experience thing than a process management thing. But who builds a process without a UI? Well, okay, some of them have no UI at all. In fact, well, talk about that in a minute. You might have a workflow that eventually creates a task, which manifests itself in any of a number of ways in SharePoint land. It may be a SharePoint task in a SharePoint task list, or an Exchange Server task in an Exchange Server task list that you see in Outlook. But you might be able to do the entire interaction with the user over an email exchange, or through a link chat, or maybe an SMS text chat, or give them the option at least to do that. You might be working with users that live elsewhere. You connect to them through the cloud. They might be public anonymous users, or they might be known users in other organizations. You might be interacting with people in social media channels. Crowdsource a document review. Monitor social media channels looking for work. Discover work in social media feeds. Those can get quite handy as well. And yes, of course, it can mean apps on devices. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But I guess where I'm going is, don't start by thinking of mobile. Start by thinking about what the solution is. And of course, one of the many ways you deliver that solution is mobile. But it shouldn't only be that. It's a process first. It's a solution first. How it manifests should be whichever way fits the user best. In fact, it's best of all if you give the user a choice. Is this real? Oh yeah, it's real. I'm telling you a whole bunch of things that I say, that Forrester says, that Gartner says, that Microsoft says, that lots of people say. But it happens in the real world. It happens in the real world quite readily. I'll give you two examples quickly. Costco. Is Costco here now? No. Sorry? It is. I thought it was. Okay, I thought it had reached the UK. They're a wholesale retailer and so on. It's a club you join, and then you can buy bulk stuff at very low prices or relatively low prices. Costco actually started using low-code, no-code workflow on a very limited basis to automate the gathering of data and the preparation of content for board of directors meetings. They did that. It worked. In fact, it took them several tries to get it right, basically because the board of directors couldn't decide what they want, but eventually they did. And that worked nicely. And then they realized, well, now we know how to do workflow. Let's use the tools that we've already paid for and the knowledge that we've acquired to tackle that problem, and that problem, and that problem, and that problem. And eventually they started doing hundreds of different independent projects and showing other people how to do it. In fact, IT is a very small development staff, one or two people that help out by providing advice, and when they have really unusual projects, they contract that out, but they have lots of citizen developers that do work for themselves now. It happens all the time. And workflow is the preferred way of getting something done because it's either workflows or dashboards, and sometimes they're connected. Siemens. Siemens is, they're actually further along on this front than anyone. Siemens has this program that they call a workflow driver's license. Basically, if you undergo a day or two of training that they provide, they issue you a real piece of paper that says you're an authorized workflow designer, and then they switch on permissions that allow you to use the tools for designing low-code, no-code workflows. And that program's been in place for years. They have thousands of people that are skilled up and able to do work in the trenches, in lines of business for themselves. IT acts as a coach, a facilitator, a resource, and a sharer It works really, really well. Occasionally they're a traffic cop. Now something's got to give in all of this, because I'm preaching about a world where you snap together stuff and you pay attention to APIs and you create mashups and you let people do this for themselves and you're their coach and all that kind of stuff. This is a different world from users come to you and ask you to build applications for them to exacting specifications. So when you give something, when you give them a world of more responsiveness and self-service, something has to go by the wayside. I'll tell you exactly what that is. Customization. Kiss customization goodbye. Integration, yes. Customization, nah. And how about this? Excessive branding. Salesforce barely lets you brand anything. CRM, not really. SharePoint lets you brand things, although it's much harder to do in Office 365, and some people complain about that. My personal view is a bit draconian about it because I'm not a branding guy. I'm saying you should brand SharePoint when you brand Word. Again, a little bit on the controversial side, and I'm not a branding guy, so you don't want to come to me with advice about branding. I think it's good to use the products, and if you want to make them your own a little bit, fine. But SharePoint provides so much utility, try using it. It's really, really useful on that front, because the effort that you take trying to move something into a different, unnatural place is the effort you could spend connecting it to something and getting work done. If you're willing to budge, and remember, if you're saying SharePoint isn't the right tool, I'm going to use nothing but software as a service, none of those guys care about excessive branding. They offer you a defined set of functionality at a known price with an easy acquisition path and an easy escape path. So there are no surprises, but there's also a limited option to customize it. But you get so much done. And if you take that same approach to your own resources, the same benefits arise. So yeah, a little bit of customization and branding isn't a bad thing, but you can't get this kind of agile stuff done if you're still going to painstakingly put everything in a certain place and make SharePoint not look like SharePoint. You won't have time. It takes too long. And so many different people get involved and have so many different opinions about what should be where. So that, as they say, is that. In summary for the whole 2 hours, I should say. Workflow makes SharePoint into an active tool. Compare that, if you would, to a passive repository. I actually think that workflow turns SharePoint into something people actually aggressively use. It turns SharePoint from a place where you put things to a place where you do things. In fact, some things are done for you, which makes SharePoint all the more valuable. In fact, Box doesn't really, or has really rudimentary workflow. Google doesn't have workflow at all unless you pay extra for it. Dropbox, nothing. OneDrive, nothing. OneDrive for Business, totally, because that's SharePoint. But it's a big, unique selling point around SharePoint is that it's not a dumb repository. It's a very smart repository where you can do value-added work. Workflow can substitute for traditional development. A lot of things that you would think of that are standalone websites could be just workflow projects that integrate into the software and the tools that you already use every day. Workflow is needed to facilitate citizen development. It's one of the two biggest tools for citizen developers. Workflow and BI tools are the things that help citizen developers build things, and whether you want them or not, citizen developers exist. You can fight them or you can help them, but they're not going away because they sit in the departments that control the budget. You can guide workflow, you can foster iteration, you can foster rethinking, you can advise people on best practices that they wouldn't think of on their own. Citizen developers actually need help learning how to think. You can do that. Integration is king, and APIs reign supreme. It's not about the bus, it's about the API. It's a lot more agile to talk to various APIs to put things together. And customization is so passé. And with that, thank you for attending. Any other questions or comments? All right, far be it from me to stand between you and lunch. Thank you very much for your time.